Now, one of the challenges of being a short guy is that when you have these things in front of you, it's a sort of camouflage. It hides, it's like my security blanket, I've been the smallest guy in the class all my life. I want to thank Chikwe and Ike for organizing this. I consider it a great honor to be invited to speak about my experiences in public service. I was introduced as a lawyer. I hate to think myself as one. I have a law degree, but I have never and will never practice law. I leave that to Oba and so on to make money from it. I want us to think about leadership and talk about leadership a little bit. Hearing Patrick, and I know him personally, were at Aspen Institute a few months ago in Colorado, raises most of the questions that have bothered many of us when we're in public service. And I'm happy that my colleague and compatriot Nuribadu is here to talk some more about it. But let me go back to the beginning. And this is the story that those that are very religious should forgive me, but I'll start with that story. It was the beginning of time, and God was creating the planet Earth and all the continents and the seas and countries. Then he came to create Africa. He threw in diamonds, gold, platinum, oil, timber, everything was there. And the Europeans and the Americans were watching very carefully. Then he made Africa's climate very nice. The soil was fertile. We didn't need to wear 2 layers of clothing to be warm. The rains come and go. You didn't need fertilizer to grow crops. At that point, the Americans and the Russians and the other Europeans complained that you are being too kind to this continent. They have everything. We have to cope with bad weather, no rains, deserts, and so on. And God said, wait until you see the leaders I give them. Now, I don't know whether this actually happened, and I'm a devout Muslim, so I ask God to forgive me for this heresy. But looking around Africa, you can see that to some degree this may well be true. Because how can a continent like ours, so rich in everything, so blessed, be so poor? Africa contains about 1 billion people. But in terms of ranking, we're the 15th largest economy in the world. What is wrong? Growing up in the village where I was born, I walk 3 miles every day to the nearest school. I didn't wear shoes until I was 8. But I kept doing that walk every day to school because the society in which I was born at that time, I was born about 50 years ago, the society that had a clear trajectory. If you got an education and you worked hard, you had a very good chance of succeeding. That's what drove us. I was orphaned at the age of 8. That's when I got to wear my first pair of shoes. But because of the society in which I grew up, the Nigeria of the 60s, I went to school. It was free. I went to high school. It was nearly free. I went to university. Again, it was almost free. And I got a good education because Nigerian universities in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were top ranked among the best universities in the world. Indeed, at that time, only those that could not get to Nigerian universities or those whose parents have too much money to waste send them over here. And nobody went to America because American education was considered inferior, believe it or not. So when I graduated from university in 1980 and I look at my life, it was a very hopeful life. I was confident that I was going to succeed. Governments were functioning. when you write a letter to a government ministry, you actually get a reply. Electricity was never stable in my life, but there was hope that it would improve. So what went wrong? Why is my daughter in the UK studying and not in Ahmadu Bello University, where I proudly got my first degree? These are troubling questions, but they all come down to one thing: the failure of leadership. I think leadership matters more in Africa than anywhere else. And often it is not leadership in the collective sense, but one person can make or break the country. And we've seen it happen. Siad Barre destroyed Somalia. It's yet to recover, almost 20 years after. And many countries are on this trajectory of failure because of the failure of leadership. Zimbabwe was a functioning country, and in 25 to 30 years, Mr. Robert Mugabe did an excellent job of destroying it. So leadership is important. But what role can we play as individuals? When I left university, I was determined to remain in the private sector, to make a lot of money and live a comfortable life. As soon as I could afford it, I bought a generator because the electricity was not very stable. When the water supply was erratic, I had a borehole in my house and a treatment plant. Then one day I could not get petrol for my car. I couldn't get gasoline. And the question I asked myself was, Nasir, what do you do now? Build your own refinery? Ladies and gentlemen, this was 1996. And for those that lived in Nigeria at that time, it was the time we had a gentleman called Sani Abacha, who decided that all our petrol imports will be undertaken by no one else but his wife. And since she was the first lady and subject to no rules, she could decide when to supply the petrol or diesel or not. So here I was, I bought a generator, I have a nice house, I have got my borehole, but I don't have gasoline. That was the first time I considered public service. It was at that point that I realized that public service is important, and that you need a minimally functioning government to enjoy your wealth, no matter how wealthy you get to be. And I undertook to myself that if I have an opportunity to be in public service, I'll give it my best shot. I will take whatever risks necessary to make it work. 3 years earlier, I'd been invited to be a state commissioner in Kaduna State. And I declined because I wasn't interested. I thought public service was for those that wish to steal or were incapable of running their businesses. I had my business, it was doing fairly well. No, why should I do it? In 1996, that changed. 2 years later, Mr. Abacha died. He had a heart attack or he ate an apple or something, nobody is sure. But, gentlemen, you are taking my 18 minutes. No, but I then found myself invited to advise the person that became the next head of state, quite by accident, because I knew him from way back, and we used to argue about how the military had destroyed Nigeria. He didn't agree with that because he was a general, and you know. So I joined the public service as a presidential advisor, and in the course of that met President-elect Obasanjo, who asked me to wait for a call because he wanted to work with me. Because we argued. The first time we met with Obasanjo, we argued on 2 issues. But there is no time for that argument now, to tell you about that argument. I go to this history to just lay the foundation that when you find yourself in public leadership in Africa, and particularly in Nigeria, you really have two choices. You could join the system, live a good life, and live happily ever after. Or you could say, I want to change this system. It is not working. It needs improvement. And then you need to be aware of the consequences. No one is more aware of this than Nuribadu and I, because we are both in exile. For these reasons. We made our choices. We knew what we were doing. There are no regrets. But I think this is what it boils down to. And wherever you see success or failure in Africa, it is because some people made these choices in one direction or the other. And my story is about those choices that I made, first as the head of the privatization agency of Nigeria, the Bureau of Public Enterprises, and then later as the minister in charge of Abuja, the nation's capital. By the time I got into public service, by the time I got my first real job, because advising the president is not a job in my view, by the time I got appointed to be the head of the Bureau of Public Enterprises, my life's experience and thoughts had already been formed in one particular direction. Okay. And this direction can be summarized in 4 points. The first is that though my country, Nigeria, of 150 million people and over 300 ethnic groups is very diverse, but I've come to the conclusion through my interactions in the private sector, in school, and so on, that there are really two kinds of people in Nigeria. They are not Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, or anything, or Muslim, or Christian, or all that crap. You really have two kinds of people. There are good people and bad people. And you find them in every religion, every ethnic group, every village, every town, every city. Because in my private sector career, I have been helped more by people from the south of Nigeria, and I'm from the north, by the way. And I have been blocked by people from the north of Nigeria more than I have seen. So I came to the conclusion that really, this is it. So I have never thought of my country along tribal, ethnic, religious lines, because my own personal experiences have persuaded me that there is nothing like that. It's just a smokescreen. So that's one. The second thing that I realized, which shaped the way I thought, was human beings are strategic and rational in their thinking. Every human being pursues what he perceives to be his best interest. And often the way to relate to people is to try to think about what would they do. What would you do in their position if you're pursuing your rational strategic interests? And if you're able to negotiate with the person along those lines, you would have a deal, whatever it is. Human beings are the same. Which brings me to the third point, that human beings respond to incentives and sanctions. People like to say Nigeria is a corrupt country. There is nothing like a corrupt country. It's all a matter of incentives. I have seen many British, Italian, and American citizens who go to Nigeria, and the things they do, you would think that they were born in Nigeria. It is all a question of incentives, and you look around the system and say, what can I get away with? The reason why people are honest in one society rather than the other is because there is a very high chance that if you're dishonest, you'll get caught. In my country, there is a very high chance if you're dishonest, you become the governor of Delta State. Finally, looking around Nigeria, I came to the conclusion that what works and seems to be improving every day is what is under the control of the private sector. And what doesn't work, or even if it works, tends to deteriorate over time, is what is controlled by the public sector. So by the time I got appointed to the Bureau of Public Enterprises, I had this wired in my brain. So in my hiring, in my pursuit of restructuring of the BPE, in the implementation of the privatization program, these were the 4 guiding principles that remained in my mind all the time. And we built a strong institution. BPE used to be one of the most respected institutions in Nigeria, with every Nigerian state represented. I went out and ensured that every state in Nigeria had at least 3 employees in BPE. When we had aptitude tests and some states did not show up, I went to the governors and said, give me CVs, second class upper and above, I will hire them. So we had a mini Nigeria, and it worked. BPE was really a good institution. And we did what we believed. We moved the Nigerian economy from the public sector control to private sector as much as possible. We set that path of reform to take the hands of the politicians, public servants, out of their hands. Of course, I knew what I was doing. I knew I would pay a price. Even before I left BPE, the House of Representatives ordered my arrest and banned me from holding public office. I was too dangerous to be in the public sector. I went to court and got it quashed before I moved on to the Federal Capital Territory. By the time I was in the Federal Capital Territory, oh, I'm running out of time. Huh? Okay. By the time we got to the Federal Capital Territory, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala had come back from the World Bank and led the economic team, which who was part of, and a few of us. And the question we asked ourselves was to go back to my very first question. What is wrong with us? What is wrong with Africa? And why are some countries doing well and others not doing so well? How can we go to Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, graduate on top of our class, yet our country doesn't work? And the countries where those at the bottom of the class came from work. What is the problem? And after a lot of debate, we came up with what we thought were the commonalities. Countries that do well do these 6 things across the board. We studied over a dozen countries and came up with these 6, which we now broke down into 4 themes. And I'll go over them very quickly. I'll not explain because they're self-explanatory. The first, all these countries had stable, legitimate governments. Not democratic, necessarily, but stable and legitimate. Second, these countries had very strong protection of rights, property rights, human rights, and so on. Third, rule of law. There were clear rules, they are predictable. You know, if you do this, this happens. If you do this, this happens. There is very little discretion in the hands of officials. Fourth, investments in human infrastructure. Fifth, investments in physical infrastructure, roads, transportation, communications, power, and so on. And finally, all these countries, without exception, depended on the power of markets. No country we studied was totally public sector driven. And this was what informed our crafting of the NEEDS program, our economic reform program, which we ran between 2003 and 2007. And this period was the period of fastest economic growth in Nigeria's history. We would like to say that we did a good job, but I think we are also lucky. Oil prices rose very high during the period. But we had a plan, and we implemented that plan. NEEDS had 4 themes: macroeconomic stabilization, public sector reform, governance and anti-corruption reform, and then investments in physical and human infrastructure. This is what we tried to do. But as you're doing that, you are trying to change the incentive structure of the society. You are trying to move from a situation whereby people sit and enjoy rents for doing nothing to one society where hard work, innovation, and results orientation lead to rewards. People are going to fight you, and you have to make that choice. And we began to pay the price. and some of us are still paying the price. Now for me, whenever I have the opportunity to speak to young people, I thought this place would be filled up by students. Sadly, I see many people about my what I encourage everyone to think about is public service is important. You must go into public service and you must make these choices and you must take these risks. We need a critical young people, Africans that are ready to go into public service and take the risks that some of us took for our countries to change. I'll make just one last point and then I'll go, which is this. It's a heretical statement, but I say it with no confidence, maybe because I run a city. I don't believe in rural development. Rural development is an oxymoron because ultimately everyone in the world will live in cities. In 2005, more than half of the world's population live in cities. Cities are centers of economic opportunities and people will all move to cities. The only people that will stay in the villages or in the countryside are either the farmers, these are food factories, or those that are romantic and want to be close to nature. But most people will live in cities. And my point is this, and this is my last point. We must find a way to manage cities better, because everyone will move to cities. And as someone that has run a city, the city of Abuja, for 4 years, I would like to think that ultimately all the cities in Nigeria will be like Abuja. We used Abuja as the laboratory of our economic reforms. So whether it was public service reform or fighting corruption or land reforms, we applied all this in Abuja. We tried to have a city, the only city in Nigeria that works. We attacked the impunity of elites. When we decided that we were going to restore the master plan of Abuja, and that necessitated taking down buildings, we carefully selected those to start with. We picked a minister, a serving minister, who had violated the rules, a senator, a general, an inspector general of police, and took down their houses. That sent a message. These guys are either crazy or they are real. Either way, it didn't make a difference. That's how we started. But at the end of the day, we had a city that worked. And since then, many cities in Nigeria, many governors are trying to do what we've done. I leave you with this thought because I think the phrase rural development was crafted to ensure that Africa remains undeveloped. I think we should all work to develop our cities and try to get everyone to move to the cities except those that choose to remain in the countryside. I thank you very much.